We are on, excuse me, 31a. We begin a new chapter, chapter 5 of Tractate Sotah. Chapter 5 is a very short chapter. It's one lengthy Mishnah with one lengthy discussion from the Gemara. And then on 31a, we already begin chapter 6. So it's a pretty short chapter. And this tractate continues with the narrative of the law of the Sotah. And at this point in the law, it loops back to the beginning, some of the discussion we had way at the beginning of our learning, page 2, 3, come back up now. And that's because of the following. So the overarching story of the Sotah, of course, begins with the husband jealous of his wife, warns her. After he warns her, do not seclude yourself with so-and-so, she does seclude herself with so-and-so. We are unaware of what happened behind closed doors. That's a key component. And therefore, he takes her to the local court. They do their investigation. They are sent up to Jerusalem. She's given a whole speech by the Kohen. She brings an offering, and she drinks the Sotah waters. That's the overarching story. Now, each of these details were discussed and elaborated at quite length. Now, at this point, what we're going to be discussing is this fact that we don't know what happened behind closed doors. We don't know what happened specifically, right? But we do know that they were behind closed doors. And the question we're going to be discussing is, with what level of certainty do we have to have this information? Meaning, with what level of certainty do we have to know that they were locked, that they were locked behind closed doors? And with what level of certainty would the Sotah law be undermined if we do know what happened behind closed doors? Meaning, ordinarily, we have to have two witnesses to establish an event. Okay, so for example, when he warns her, do not seclude yourself, he doesn't do so in the presence of two witnesses. And then when she secludes herself, how many witnesses do we need for that? One guy comes and says, I saw that they were locked behind closed doors. Is she now a Sotah, or do I have to have two witnesses? If a woman says, I saw through the window that they misbehaved, is the Sotah law called off because now we know what happened? What's the degree of certainty we need in this? This is where we are, which means it's going to loop us back to what we discussed in the beginning, because the first thing we discussed is the presence of witnesses necessary at the warning, and what type of witnesses would you need or not need to tell us that they were closed, that they actually spent some time behind closed doors. So this is going to be a discussion that we're going to be having now, which is related to a discussion earlier. Clear where we're going? Okay. So for our purposes, there are two events that are either being witnessed or not. A, that they were behind closed doors. And B, what happened there? Do we know what happened there or not know what happened there?
Maybe she was learning Torah.
Yeah, that would be a strange one, but it's a possibility. We discussed that once before.
Yeah. Think positive.
Sorry?
You have to think positive.
Yeah, I don't know how positive it is. Guys locked behind closed doors teaching a married woman Torah after the wife warned her. I don't know how positive I would call that. I don't know. Anyway, okay, so let's see. So it begins the Mishnah, middle of 31a, chapter 5. Mishakinu li'ishtay, one who warned his wife about secluding herself with a specific guy. And he did so according to the law with the witnesses and everything. Now, v'nistra, and then she did indeed go ahead and seclude herself with that fellow. But he doesn't have that information yet. So with what level of certainty do we establish that she indeed was behind closed doors with this guy? And that therefore, two things. Number one, the Sotah law would begin. He can take her to the temple. But for the purposes of our discussion, if he chooses not to bring her to the temple, he doesn't want to go through with it. So we learned that the law is they have to divorce, and she forfeits her ketubah. Right? We discussed this in the past. The ketubah is a document that's meant to protect her, right? It shouldn't be, by law, marriage is on the husband, he gives her a ring, and divorce is on the husband, he gives her the get. So if it doesn't cost him anything, he'll just throw a get and say goodbye. And we want him to think twice before he throws a get to her. And therefore we say, okay, you can throw a get, no problem, but it's going to cost you. That's what the ketubah is. But if she misbehaves and Torah law wants them to divorce, then Torah says no ketubah, throw her the get. That's the point, right? So now, if she secluded herself with this guy about which she was just warned, so she forfeits her ketubah. So to what degree of certainty can we say we know she was behind closed doors, to the point that if he decided not to go through with the Sotah law, she would lose her ketubah? So it's not just a question of Sotah law; it's very weighty. It has serious ramifications. If we're going to accuse her of being locked behind closed doors, it means she loses her ketubah, right to the ketubah. So it's a very serious matter. So says the Mishnah, afilu shama. This is an exaggerated term, but afilu shama, even if he hears about this seclusion, ma'oif ha'pareach, from a bird that flies, from a flying bird, meaning even it's very tenuous. Someone who ordinarily is not kosher as a witness, a slave, a child. I don't know about a child, but I think a child even. However, he found out, but he discovered by some rumor, by some way, by this bird flying in the air, that tells him, your wife was behind closed doors with this guy about which you warned. So in this case, if he doesn't want to go through with the Sotah law, divorce, and she loses her ketubah. Even though ordinarily you need two witnesses to establish an event. In this instance, we're going to derive it from the verses soon, but the logic is, in this instance, there's what's called raglayim l'davar. There are feet to the story. There's already been a warning in front of witnesses. We already know that this marriage is on the rocks. We already know that there's jealousy. We already know that she's suspected with this guy. So if we have some sort of footing, some sort of rumor that says that they were actually secluded, that's enough. Considering the fact that he warned her and there's a whole history. So Divid Rabbi Lezer, this is the words of Rabbi Lezer. So Rabbi Lezer is of the view that the seclusion does not need to have two witnesses to establish it as an event. The warning does, and the lead up does, but once all that lead up is there, and there's already a baggage of story and history between the two of them and this third party, we don't need the full-on two witnesses to tell us. We know that we saw so-and-so close herself in a door with so-and-so.
So even if it's circumstantial evidence, but the warning was issued.
That's right.
That kosher's.
That's right. Even if it's circumstantial evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But because the whole background has been firmly established, we accept that as a fact, and she loses her ketubah.
Firmly established means the warning.
Meaning your warning was done,
Right.
and it was recorded in the Beis Din that he warned her under such circumstances, and the Beis Din investigated, and they see that there's indeed a question of a jealousy and concern, and so on and so forth. So the circumstances have been established. So the particular event is only circumstantial evidence, but it's enough for her to lose the right to ketubah. Mm-hmm. Clear? This is Rabbi Lezer's view. Mm-hmm. But Rabbi Yeshua says it has to be much more than that. Rabbi Yeshua is of the view that you need to have two witnesses who come and tell us, we saw her seclude herself with this guy. And without that, no Sotah law. So if that's the case, at what point can we say, okay, so you don't have witnesses that tell us that these two were secluded. But there's so much going on between them, at what point can we say she's misbehaved enough that he can divorce her and not pay the ketubah? In other words, there's a double-edged sword here. On the one hand, Rabbi Lezer is quite lenient. You just have circumstantial evidence of her hanging out behind closed doors, and boom, she loses her ketubah. It's pretty harsh. On the other hand, here's a woman who's misbehaving, flirting around town, but I'm stuck now paying out this massive ketubah because I can't get witnesses that she actually secluded herself behind closed doors for X amount of time. So what do I do? So it says Rabbi Yeshua, to establish the Sotah law, you have to have two witnesses that she was secluded behind closed doors. But to divorce her, as long as you have substantiated claim to her misbehaving, then you can divorce her. And what would be that? So he says like this: Ache yisu v'yitnu ba mizares b'lavana. Once you got to a point where, this is the Gemara's expression to describe women who are of ill repute. They hang around and chat and flirt. They're called those who knit by the moon. They knit by the light of the moon. So which means that they're hanging out at nighttime in public with kind of public activity that garners attention. They're chatting about all the gossip. So if that group of ladies are busy chatting about your wife, hanging out with different people, if you got to that point, you can divorce her and give her a ketubah, and she'll lose her ketubah, right? But the bird flying in the air telling us, oh, there's a rumor that says she hung out with the guy behind closed doors, that's not enough for Rabbi Shua's view. So this is the dispute. Rabbi Lezer says if the warning was issued with all the right circumstances, then even a rumor that they're hanging out behind closed doors is enough for divorce and lose her ketubah. Which Rabbi Shua says, no, for that kind of Sotah law, you need to have two witnesses. But if her misbehavior has got to the point that the gossipers, that the women who knit by the moon are chatting about her what's the word, escapades, or her, yeah, then it's gotten far enough, and she forfeits her ketubah. This is the dispute between Rabbi Shua and Rabbi Lezer.
The bottom line, though, is divorce is going to happen, except it's only a function of whether he has to pay off the ketubah.
That's right.
And that is conditional upon the kosher
That's right,
witnesses in discussion.
That's right. Because you're right. The truth is you get divorced if you want to and pay out the ketubah, but the ketubah could be very expensive. And it could be unfair to him. You know, we created a document to protect her, and now it's coming to stab him in the back. He can't get out of a marriage that's clearly falling apart unless he pays out. The point was that I shouldn't just, throw a divorce and let her run off. And now she's running off anyway. She's hanging out with all these guys. But because I don't have my two witnesses thing, I have to pay out now a huge amount. So Rabbi Lezer says if you have all the warnings and everything else, and everything is there grounded and recorded, so even if a rumor is there, it's enough. Whereas Rabbi Shua says, no, it's got to be much more than that.
Yeah, because she has to go through a lot of humiliation.
Right, so for the Sotah law for sure, but here he's talking about where he doesn't want to go through the Sotah law because he doesn't want to humiliate her, but he wants to divorce her. Is he now bound by paying her the ketubah? Well, the question is going to be, how strong is this rumor? In Rabbi Lezer's view, if the birds are chirping about it, it's enough. And according to Rabbi Shua, you have to have the town gossipers talk about it. And if the town gossipers talk about it, then it's enough to say, she's been promiscuous, you can lose the ketubah. Even though we don't know that she actually misbehaved and she was actually unfaithful. We don't know that. Okay. So from this, you're clear with me, Scott? Mm-hmm. So from here, the Gemara gets to the law regarding the witness about what she did behind closed doors, right? Because there's the witnesses of the warning that we already established way back when. We have two witnesses that she warned. We have the witness to the event of them secluding themselves, and here we have a dispute. Rabbi Shua says you need two witnesses to establish that they were secluded behind closed doors for the Sotah law to begin. And Rabbi Lezer is of the view that even a bird flying in the wind tells us that they were locked behind closed doors. It's enough to make the Sotah law begin. But in order for the Sotah law to be valuable, we have to know that they were locked behind closed doors, yes, and we established the dispute about how much evidence we need to establish that. But we also have to not know what happened behind closed doors. Because as soon as we know that they misbehaved, no Sotah law, they just divorced without ketubah. Right? The Sotah law is for her to drink the water to establish her innocence or guilt behind closed doors. So it's predicated on us not knowing what happened behind closed doors. We know they were behind closed doors, that we established, but we don't know what happened. So if witnesses come forward and tell us that, hey, there's a window and I saw what happened and I saw that they actually were unfaithful, Sotah law is called off, divorce, no ketubah. So to what degree of certainty, what level of witnesses do I need?
Why would the Sotah be called off?
Because we know what happened. Because they were actually unfaithful. The whole Sotah law is her to drink the water to find out whether or not she's innocent or guilty. If she's guilty, she dies, and if she's innocent, she lives and gets blessing. Right? But if we already know she's guilty, what is she drinking the Sotah water for? We already know. We have witnesses that say that she misbehaved, she was actually unfaithful. So there's no reason for the Sotah law. Following?
Yeah, but only to put the Sotah law into place, you need witnesses.
That they were secluded, but not that they actually misbehaved. See, there's the two steps of witnesses. Till now, we discussed the witnesses to their seclusion without knowing what happened behind the doors. Now we're discussing the witnesses who potentially come forward and say, I know what happened behind closed doors, the window, and I saw. Or whatever, I walked in on them or something. So I can say with certainty that they were actually unfaithful. And then Sotah law called off. Clear? So what level of witnesses do I need for that? So says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, I'm sorry, Amar Eid Echad, one witness, a single witness comes forward and says, Anidi Yisiya, I saw them, or her, Shenitmis, that she was intimate, she was defiled. Even one witness. Ordinarily, we need two witnesses to establish an event. But here, because again, there's feet to the story, the circumstances are very overwhelmingly suspicious of her, and therefore, even if one witness comes forward and says, I saw the two of them be intimate behind closed doors, she wouldn't drink the water. It's done. Sotah law is off. Because we have a witness now that tells us she was unfaithful, even if it's only one.
They still has to interview this guy.
Yeah, any witness.
Got to go through a lot.
Any witnesses we describe here have gone through a rigorous Chakiro Drisha, what's called.
Vetting.
A serious vetting. They vet the story in all kinds of manners. Besides for what day, what time, location, but even things like was she wearing any clothes, what color were the clothing, what color was the wall, and all kinds of circumstantial questions to get them to trip up, to get the witness to trip up, to see if they actually can. There's a whole set of laws around this, but yes, absolutely.
See, that's not a setup.
Sorry?
You want to make sure it's not a setup. The guy was a faithful wife.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that's nowadays 3 prakim, the study cycle, 3 chapters of Rambam a day is learning the laws of witnesses. So we're going through all this, yeah. Moreover, says the Mishnah, even if a slave, a shifcha or a maidservant, so it's a woman, a slave, lots of reasons to, and it's only for one single person. So under ordinary circumstances, this would not be considered a valid witness to establish an event. Nonetheless, they are all believed if they come forward and say, and are investigated and vetted, they are believed to say, I saw that she was defiled, she was unfaithful, and therefore, not only is the law called off, but she even loses her ketubah. Again, because of all the circumstances around it, we have witnesses. We already established that there was a secluded behind closed doors. We already established his jealousy. We already established the marriages on the rocks, and so on and so forth. So with these one witness, even if it's a slave, even if it's a maidservant, who comes forward and says, I saw behind closed doors that they were unfaithful, Sotah law calls off. With the exception of 5 women. There are 5 women, if they come forward and say, we saw that she was unfaithful, then the Sotah law is called off, but she doesn't forfeit a ketubah because we suspect that these 5 women are lying. And this is, it's a funny phenomenon. I'm kind of smirking because the Gemara establishes in the Tractate Yevamis, and then it comes up throughout the Gemara. The Gemara establishes that there are 5 women that hate each other. And they're always suspect of hating each other. And that because of jealousy. And that is Chamoisa, her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law is jealous of her taking away her son. So there's reason to suspect that she's lying about her daughter's behavior, or daughter-in-law's behavior. Ubas Chamoisa, the daughter of her mother-in-law, so her sister-in-law. Right? There's reason to believe that there's some sort of jealousy there. Vitzarasa, her sister wife. So if there's one man married to 2 women, you can imagine jealousy between the 2. V'yivimta, the woman who is her yavam, which means her sister-in-law, but her husband's brother's wife. Before we talked about the mother-in-law's daughter, which is her husband's sister. Now we're talking about her husband's sister-in-law. So it's the other sister-in-law. The sister-in-law because it's her husband's sibling, or sister-in-law because it's married to her husband's sibling. Both of these women are suspect of being jealous. Ubas Baila, and the daughter of her husband, meaning not her own daughter, but her husband's daughter from a previous marriage or from another woman. Again, there's jealousy there. So in other words, any woman who has some sort of other relationship with her husband's mother, her husband's sister, her husband's sister-in-law, husband's daughter, who have reason to be jealous of her stealing their man, is suspect of lying. These 5 women.
Did you include the maid?
No, it doesn't say.
The maid doesn't want to lose her job.
It doesn't mention the maid here. It doesn't. Actually, in a number of cases, the Gemara talks about the maid being taking favor to the woman of the house, who was nicer to her, rather than the master of the house. A number of cases that's seen that way. But it doesn't mention it here. So it's these 5 women: mother-in-law, daughter of mother-in-law, sister-in-law, that is her brother-in-law's wife, her sister wife, if there's 2 wives, and then her husband's daughter. Any other woman, basically, who has a claim to this guy has reason to be jealous of her. And therefore, we're going to believe them as far as calling off the Sotah law, because they are telling us that she was intimate. And there is enough reason to believe that she was unfaithful because of the warnings and everything else. But not to the point that she forfeits her ketubah, because it could be they're lying because they want to make her lose the ketubah. So divorce, don't go through with the Sotah, but she can still collect the ketubah. She just doesn't drink the water. So we have so far 3 laws we learned in the Mishnah. Law number 1 is the dispute as to what level of certainty do we have to have that they were actually even secluded. Rabbi Lezer says even a bird chirping tells us good enough. Rabbi Shua says no, you need to have 2 witnesses that tell us that they were secluded behind closed doors. And if you want to divorce her without witnesses to their being locked behind closed doors, you need to have the local gossip women talk about her. That's the first law, this dispute. Law number 2 we learned is that even one witness who tells us that she was unfaithful, then Sotah law is off and she loses her ketubah, even if that one person is a slave, a maidservant, and so on. And law number 3 is the exception to this rule. There are 5 women who have a claim, as it were, to be in relationship with this guy, and therefore they're suspect of being jealous of this woman. And therefore, if they come forward and say, we saw her misbehave, we saw her being unfaithful, then the Sotah law is called off. She doesn't drink, but we're not going to make her lose her ketubah, because it could be they're only doing this out of jealousy to make her lose her ketubah. And therefore divorce, but she gets to collect the ketubah.
What happens in the case if the wife sees that the husband is fooling around with the maid, so she goes and fools around with somebody else?
We learned this, that the same way the water investigates her misbehaviors and investigates his misbehavior. So if he's misbehaving, even though she drinks the water, it'll cause him to have his demise too. So he's got to think twice before he starts pulling her to the bedroom. Right. Look in the mirror. That was one of the first things we learned here, is that before a husband goes and starts warning his wife, look in the mirror and see what's going on in your own life before you start blaming her. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Because God willing, tomorrow, what the Gemara is going to do is, the Gemara is going to do a comparative analysis between the witnesses who tell us that she was locked behind closed doors, and the witnesses that tell us that she was actually defiled, she was actually unfaithful. Compare that to the witnesses of her being locked behind closed doors, and get to the verses that establish how many witnesses you need for each of these events. This is going to coming up, God willing, tomorrow. Have a wonderful day, Eden.
Stop recording.